A long time ago, in a land far, far away, there lived a bunch of brothers, and one father and two mothers. And most of the brothers were children of the first mother, but two were children of the second, more beloved wife. And the father, unfortunately, treated them as more beloved. And one of them was enough to understand. He felt the pride and the privilege of being father's favorite. So he lorded it over his older brothers, and he curdled the relationship, and they grew to despise him, because they too wanted their father's love. And this teenage boy, what did he deserve it more than them? And then one day, it just reaches the worst. Their father comes home with this coat that's like more beautiful than any coat they've ever seen, and they can't figure out where the money came to buy it. And the next time little brother just gets under their skin, they decide they've had enough. And collectively, they chuck Joseph into a well, an empty cistern, and they sell him to the next caravan coming by. They take his coat and they leave him to go, to be sold into slavery. And with all of their malice and all of their pain at not being the ones so loved, they take the Technicolor dream coat and they spread blood all over it. And they take it back to their father and say, something desperate happened. Joseph is dead. And effectively, he is. And we only know that one of the brothers feels the slightest stab of remorse about what has happened. And the story follows Joseph, who goes to live in the land of Egypt as a slave. And there is a series of events that happen, and he begins to grow up. He's faced the loss of everything and the edge of his own existence. And his arrogance and his ego begin to subside. And in the midst of that, Joseph begins to find God, or perhaps more aptly, God finds Joseph, and begins to use Joseph's skill set for better things than arrogance and self-importance. And Joseph has this talent with dreams, and he uses it to help other people in prison. And he begins to develop into this person who looks out for others, who isn't just thinking about himself. He kind of grows up, but he also changes. And pretty soon, his dream interpreting skills reach the upper echelon, and he's interpreting dreams for Pharaoh. And then he's promoted out of prison, and he actually finds himself at the top of a pyramid, hierarchical one, right next to Pharaoh, saving people in the land from a coming famine. And they store up all this grain, and then the famine comes, and he begins to distribute the grain for a price. And peasants from all over the countryside come, and he gets kind of used to the flow of people. And one day, all the faces in front of him look very familiar, and it's his brothers. And all the work he's done around what his brothers did to him, he thinks that he's moved past it, but there they are in front of him. He doesn't know what to do. And so he decides to hide his identity. And he reverts. Seeing his brothers casts him back to who he used to be. And he begins to manipulate them. He puts one into prison. The younger one, he hides like this silver cup in a sack of grain and like frames him for theft. Sends them back, makes them come again. And then finally, when we drop into the text today, Joseph comes to his senses. And he realizes that's not actually who he is. He's become someone different over all of the decades. And so he tells his brothers who he is. And the text says they're dismayed. But the Hebrew is really closer to like they're absolutely terrified, because this man who's just been playing sort of trick games on them seems a lot like the younger brother they sold into slavery. And in a culture of sort of retribution, what's the revenge that's coming? They don't know. And they stand in front of him, and he's talking about God, and they're like, oh, geez, how are we going to get out of this? We've got to somehow save our family. Like, we're going to be going to jail. And then Joseph's weeping and tells them to come closer. And of course they do, because the power differential is massive. And Joseph says he's going to have mercy on them, and they tentatively begin to talk to him because they're starving to death. What choice do you have in a famine? And Joseph comes through. He offers them a really unexpected mercy. He talks to his Egyptian overlords, and they move to the land of Goshen, a great place for their herding of sheep, their grazing lifestyle. And Joseph doesn't move in with them. He keeps his job in downtown Egypt. He's not about to move back to the family farm. Not just because he doesn't know much about sheep anymore, but he can't go back there. He can't subject himself again to his brothers. He can show them mercy, but he just can't go there. And even after years, his dad finally dies, and the brothers are still afraid of Joseph. They come and they say, we know Dad's dead, but what he really wanted was for you to forgive us, so can we stay? And Joseph's like, yeah, of course. It's not mine to be retributive. That belongs to God alone. And Joseph goes back to what he was doing, and the brothers go back to their sheep. And that's kind of the end of the story. Because, forgiveness is hard. And showing mercy isn't easy. And sometimes the church is a little bit guilty of presenting it as easier than it is. And it leads people to feel a lot of guilt if forgiveness is kind of hard. Or it leads us to sort of put a forgiveness face on and hide deep within the sore and the wound. And we just kind of move on, but it festers because forgiveness is hard. Or worse than that, the church has sent people back into dire, abusive circumstances, offering a kind of happily ever after, forgive everything circumstance, and that's just not right. Or we ask people to just forgive in an instant and ask for no justice. Forgiveness is hard. And I think that's the gift of a story like Joseph. The mountain of trying to forgive can seem so daunting. Where do you start? Where's the path? And I think the story of Joseph offers some really lovely handholds. They're not perfect. The story isn't perfect. But maybe that's more true about how forgiveness is. I think it's a hopeful story, though, for a few reasons. Joseph goes through a process of coming to grips with what has happened to him. He's sold into slavery as a teenager. The story then picks up much later. It's decades before he sees a brother again. We're naive to think that Joseph didn't spend a lot of time in the middle processing what happened to him, trying to make sense of how his own family sold him into slavery. That is not a light matter. Even in the ancient world, that is not a light matter. And he spends time figuring that out. It takes time to process it, to really come okay with it, to find some peace about it. It's not the work of an instant. It's the work of a lifetime. And he thinks he's done it. He's living a good life. He's at peace. He's actually reached more power and privilege than he could have ever imagined as a shepherd. Then his brothers show up. And he goes back to what he used to be. He makes the mistake of messing with them. I grew up and the story was just kind of like, oh, look, he puts him in prison and he frames the younger brother. Man, that stuff's not kind. That's Joseph going back to who Joseph was before, exercising his power to manipulate, making it about himself. And family systems psychology, which has been around for decades now, says that that's what happens. We try to become someone different, we go through all this work, and then the systems that are so much a part of our lives, we walk back into them and think we can be different, and they press us back down. And we think, man, didn't I do all that work? What am I doing? And that's exactly what happens to Joseph. He comes to his senses. He's like, what am I doing? This isn't who I want to be. And he tells them who he is now. So despite the mistake and despite the reversion to his old self, it doesn't end the trajectory of forgiveness. Our journey is more a spiral than a line. And he does the right thing. He finds it within himself to offer mercy. But it's not like happily ever after kind of like Disney film flick experience. He and his brothers manage a kind of ceasefire. we don't ever see any sense that they have the really deep conversations that would have to happen for like real forgiveness to take place. The brothers maybe haven't done their work. They're still terrified of Joseph, that he's going to kick them out of the land. And they can't live together. Joseph just can't go back to be who he used to be. He doesn't have the kind of trust with, but they manage to be at peace. And it's more peace than they would have found if Joseph had not done any of his work, if Joseph had not offered them mercy. And the most important thing about the story, perhaps for Joseph, is that he didn't do it on his own. What Joseph tells his brothers is, it was a lot of bad that happened. But over the decades, I've learned this, that God is in the mess of it all. That it's through the power of God I've kind of found my way. I'm able to stand in front of you and give you the grain you need, not because I'm a perfect human, but because God has done something in me and I can actually let it go. I can find the space to live with a little peace. And so is the forgiveness that happens in this family perfect? No, it's kind of a mess. But then isn't that more close to reality? But Joseph is more peaceful than he would have been, and his brothers' lives are saved. And so it's a story of a messy family, an incomplete forgiveness, but one in which people grow, and they learn, and they find more forgiveness and peace than they would have without it. And I think that's a little bit of a handhold. As we look at whatever it is in our lives we're asked to forgive, it can seem a little daunting to just not judge or to forgive completely or to go the extra mile, not castigating that. But the Joseph story adds a little depth to it, a little complexity. And maybe, just maybe, it helps us see the first handholds. That God is present in all of it, working in us always, to do more than we can ask or imagine, to always bring good from ill, in our lives, and in the lives of our families, and in the life of our community.